when you're pitching and flipping a jig like we've been doing out here today, one of the things that you want to do is make sure you got big, heavy line. I think that 17 is about the minimum you want to get away with. I actually broke my line setting the hook today, but I hadn't retied in about an hour, and I was down in the bushes and might not have been a big fish, but you never know. Down here you could set the hook and have a 12 or 13 pounder. But you want to use a pretty heavy line. You know, really probably ought to be doing it with 25. I just happened to put this on 17. I've stayed with it all day. Here's another thing that you want to do on your jigs. I've got a little football head jig, which is a great flipping jig. It's got a little bit lighter hook than probably you might ought to have, but it's a great, just a little lucky strike football head jig. But I always flare that weed guard out. I flare the weed guard out and make it about an inch, inch and a half wide. That gives me a little bit more protection out here. It doesn't get me hung up near as much. Plus the fact the fish has got a little bit easier to push that down and get down to that hook. One of the key things you want to do is throw it in the heaviest possible cover you can find. In other words, if you can find a hole that you can get your bait right down the middle of it, get your bait right down in the middle of it. Remember, it's a lot easier to get a bait out with a fish hanging on it than it is without one on there, because the hook is down in his mouth. So don't worry about that. Throw it in the meanest, toughest spot that you can. Right in the heart of it. You know, we talk about them being hanging in tight to the wood. That's the reason when they're in these areas like this. Now, we caught several fish out away from the wood. Sometimes those fish follow it out. Sometimes they're out on the edge. But if you get down tight into the wood, you're going to be a lot better off. So heavy line, and it doesn't really matter. I use a high-speed reel. The only reason I use a high-speed reel is once I get my pitch made, I want to get that bait out of there and pitch it back in again. 90% of your strikes are going to come on the fall, so you don't need to work it too much. Let it fall to bottom. If you don't get a bite, try again. If you do, set the hook.